If you're just joining us here, in part one of this series, I talked a little bit about Civil War tactics and also gave some examples from the Battle of Antietam, where we can learn something of how tactics were applied during the Civil War. But now we go from the bloodiest single day of the war to the bloodiest battle of the war. And at Gettysburg, we find a lot of wonderful examples of terrible narratives that have come up through the popular culture, and not in any small part because of the movie, but also we find a lot of wonderful examples to refute certain popularly held beliefs about Civil War tactics and what was important during the Civil War. Now, if you watch the movie and just go by what the movie seems to indicate, you'd be led to believe that the most desperate part of the fighting in the first day of the battle was the cavalry fight. Buford's dismounted cavalry versus the Confederates who were coming in on directly on Seminary Ridge. Now, this is the movie following the book, because the book puts a tremendous amount of focus on the cavalry fight. But what if I told you that for that entire day, Buford's troops only lost about 200 men, less than 200 men actually. I think it was closer to like 180 men. Buford's action on that day was entirely a delaying action, having his men fight dismounted, fanned out in skirmish lines in loose order with advanced posts that were set up to delay the Confederate advance as they rolled back towards Seminary Ridge. It wasn't until the 1st and the 11th Corps came in, the infantry, that the first day's battle really started to heat up. Now, if you watch Ken Burns' Civil War, Burns has the statement in there that I believe itself is pretty overstated, but he says that compared to what was to come, the first day's fighting was a mere skirmish. And then some people take that further, and then they also take what they see in the movie, and they sort of make the argument that the first day's fighting basically was a skirmish. And sure, if you compare it to the second day, there are some historians who actually believe that the second day of Gettysburg was the bloodiest day of the war, not Antietam. But the point is, it was that close. So, as a fraction of the casualties in the battle, it's not even making up half of the fraction, but still, if you take it by itself, the first day at Gettysburg is one of the top 20 bloodiest days of the war. This was no skirmish. And if you go back to what I had said before about the organization and the order of battle of the different armies and how Confederate regiments and brigades, divisions, and corps were oftentimes larger than their federal counterparts, the 1st and 11th were up against the Confederate 2nd and 3rd, but two corps on two corps was not an even match. The Federal 1st and 11th Corps were outnumbered nearly 2-1, and they still fought and held on for several hours, allowing the rest of the army the time that they needed to come up. So, I don't want to hear anything disparaging the fighting spirit of the Federal soldier or their abilities in combat, because a lot of it did have to do with ability in combat. I don't mean to write off fighting spirit as an important thing. It certainly is. Believing in what you're fighting for is very important, but, the Federal soldier was, at the very least, every bit as capable as his Confederate counterpart, regardless of what certain narratives would have you believe about the fighting spirit and the capabilities of the different armies. And something else to remember is that the two sides didn't really have a great idea at any point during the battle exactly what was in front of them. And again, I hate to keep beating up on the movie, but again, as I said, it's adapting the book. But this is where a lot of people get their history from. But the movie makes it sound like they knew exactly who was at their front during various points during the first day's battle. They knew what divisions and corps they were able to up against, and so they knew the relative strengths of the enemy, and this wasn't the case. And given how long the 1st and the 11th Corps fought, and how well they fought, it was entirely possible that Lee believed that he'd routed a larger portion of the Army of the Potomac on the first day than he actually had. And that might have lent to his overconfidence later in the battle. And the Federal soldiers did so well during those initial engagements because they didn't just stand in lines to get shot down. They used every tactical and terrain advantage that they could. And so to kind of demonstrate this, I'm going to follow the experiences of one brigade and focus on one regiment in particular. The brigade I'm going to be focusing on is the Pennsylvania Bucktail Brigade. It was under the command of Colonel Royce Stone. Stone had been recently promoted from the 149th Pennsylvania, which is the regiment I'm going to be focusing on more so than the others. And this is because both this brigade and this regiment, the reason I'm focusing on them is because their experience this day is a really good example of a lot of the things that I've been talking about in this video, but also because I have an ancestral connection to the 149th Pennsylvania. I am not going to say who my ancestor was, because given the other information I've revealed in these videos, it would make it really easy to dox me, but that's the reason I've done so much research on this particular unit. Now, the Bucktail Brigade was in an interesting position in the Army of the Potomac. It was founded to be an elite unit. The origins of the unit are that it was founded by a number of the officers who were part of the original Bucktail Regiment, the 13th Pennsylvania Reserve, who had a reputation of being an elite regiment. And so some of the officers from there went off and decided to use that as a recruiting tool to get an entire brigade together. And the Bucktails had to be able to present a bucktail that they brought themselves as proof of their skill with the gun. And so, they had to be able to demonstrate their marksmanship just to be a member of this unit. And then the training that they underwent, the 143rd, 149th, and 150th Pennsylvania, the training that they underwent was with the expectation that they were going to be an elite unit despite just being volunteers. Now, the Bucktail Brigade had not seen any significant combat in the war before Gettysburg. They were present at a number of engagements, but other than doing some light skirmishing duty, they didn't really do a whole lot. So this was their first major action, but they'd been mustered in for almost 10 months at that point, and they had spent all of that time drilling and learning, having it beaten their heads, the discipline, the tactics, the even marksmanship. They actually practiced marksmanship, as I said, unlike a lot of other units in the Civil War, but that was something that they were actually quite skilled at. Now, the Bucktail Brigade arrived fairly early by comparison in the morning of the first day's fight. They arrived with the Iron Brigade marching double quick, which is sort of like a jog for the last mile before they finally got into position. Once they got there, they set up to the right side of the Iron Brigade. The Iron Brigade famously fought in McPherson's Woods. They fought a fierce defensive engagement there, which included quite a bit of counterattack, because you're not just standing in place when you're defending. You're also engaging in counterattacks. But the Iron Brigade's exploits on this day are pretty well known. The Bucktail Brigade in general, and the 149th in particular, were set up near McPherson's farm. Now, the 149th, their position was very close to the buildings of the McPherson farm and also the Chambersburg Pike. Chambersburg Pike had a sunken trail that was right beside the main road, so that was used for cover, and they set up in a refused position, so that angle that we brought up before when we were talking about Antietam. So they were set up in a position that some of the companies were facing west and some of the companies were facing more northwest. And the first order that Stone gave, other than for the guys to fall out and to get a little bit of rest and prepare for the battle, was for each of the regiments to take one company as their skirmish company, move it up to the left flank, forward and to the left of the rest of the brigade. They also deployed the brigade's sharpshooter platoon out in this area. And, if all of these guys are marksmen, I can only imagine how good a shot the sharpshooters were. But this shows us that they're using what they have, and they're using what they know in order to create an advantageous situation. Again, they're not just all standing out there in a line waiting for the enemy to come. And Stone's thinking in all of this is that they're more concerned about the threat off to the northwest. So by putting his men in this position, by moving the skirmishers out this way, he can then have the rest of his guys concentrate more of their fire off to the northwest. But the brigade spent about a good hour lying down, staying out of sight, using this position so that way they could rest, they could recuperate. A lot of them were exhausted. They needed to get their strength back. Now, they kind of figured that in this position they weren't visible to the enemy. But as it turns out, the Confederates kind of knew that they were there the entire time. There were Confederate batteries that were off to the northwest that were firing on different Federal units. And because they didn't have the infantry support on the field in that position at that time, they didn't label the Bucktails as a priority. They didn't fire anything their way. But that changed, and more Confederate units started to come up. Most of these guys are from North Carolina. And when they had the infantry there, the Confederates started firing down on the Bucktail position. It's an insane cannonade that started to rain down at around 1 p.m. on the Bucktails. And the men stay as close to the ground as they possibly can, but they still take a lot of losses during this time. It's shell and solid shot, so as long as you're able to locate those shots well, you can do some damage. And the Bucktails, and the 149th in particular, took a lot of damage on this line. They lost some men, they lost some officers. During this intense shelling, Lieutenant Colonel Walton Dwight, who was the commanding officer of the regiment after Stone left, he does his part. He goes up and down the line. He makes sure that all of his subordinates know what's going on. They're all in good communication with each other, and they're all making sure that the men stay down. And he's also giving orders. He's shoring up the men, and he's out there offering a commanding presence. Now, a lot of people in the regiment speculated that the reason he had such a commanding presence and was able to hold it together was because he was drunk at the time. He was known to take a few drinks, and the soldiers oftentimes would say that he was shot in the neck, which was a euphemism that they used for someone who was drunk. But during the artillery barrage, after this had lasted for long enough that he and Stone realized that they needed to do something about it, Dwight and Stone come up with a clever plan. They tell the color guard of the unit, the guys who are responsible for the regimental flags, to move about 100 yards off the unit, off to one side. This had been done before during the Civil War, but it wasn't that common. But it shows, again, they're thinking about the situation. They're not just being dummies about it. So the color guard moved off, and they took cover behind some rocks, and this had the desired effect. The Confederates thought that the unit was advancing, and so they adjusted their artillery fire and started firing on these guys. And because there were only 4 or 5 of them, you pretty much would have needed a direct hit to do any damage. This relieves the artillery barrage for some time because now the Confederates are concentrated over on this ruse. And also the infantry units that the North Carolina units that the Confederates brought up, now they start reacting to where they believe the Bucktail Brigade's position is, which is to say where the color guard is. So they take a wider berth around the units than they would otherwise take, which doubly relieves the pressure that's on the rest of the brigade. Now, the Confederates did eventually figure out that something was amiss here, and we'll get back to that later, but it worked for a time. It relieved pressure from the brigade, and it gave them time to redress their lines. Dwight went up and down, talked to his captains, or in some cases it was now lieutenants who were in charge of these companies because captains had been injured. But they were able to get back into some sort of formation. And then he ordered, seeing the Confederates approaching, he ordered another one of his companies to move off about 300 yards ahead of everybody else and start a skirmish line out there. The Confederates, who are pushing in from the northwest, run into the skirmish line. And they weren't expecting anybody to be out there. So they get blocked off for a time. Again, another speed bump. And Dwight orders his men. The Confederates are about 600 yards or so off at this point. He orders his men to adjust sights and fire over the skirmishers and hit and fire upon the Confederates. Now, for any other Civil War unit, this would have been a waste, but the Bucktails were slightly different in that regard. They had the training to be able to do this, and because of the trajectory of the rounds during the Civil War, they were able to fire over the heads, and it didn't really put their guys in that big of a danger. So the advance of the North Carolinians is completely blocked at this point. They don't know whether they want to come or they want to go, and so they start pulling back. Now, this is where it gets a little dumb. I have to say the leadership during this battle, while it's not as good as it could be in some places, is fairly decent. But the coordination is excellent, and the training of the unit is excellent. It's able to overcome a lot of these problems. But Stone gets another idea in his head. He does not want the Confederates to take the railroad cut that is on the opposite side of the field from the right flank of his men. Now remember, the Bucktails they're bent back. They've refused their line. But still, being shot at from that position would allow the Confederates a pretty good angle to shoot down the entire length of the line. Not a bad idea in theory. The problem is they hadn't scouted the railroad cut ahead of time. They knew that there was a railroad cut there, but they had no idea what the depth of the cut was, how steep it was, anything else like that. Following this order, the 149th sprinted out toward the railroad cut. Luckily for them at this point, there wasn't a lot of fire that was concentrated on that area of the field. They did take some artillery fire, but it wasn't tremendously consequential, and they have those skirmishers off who are preventing them from being flanked while they're making this movement. But once they get to the railroad cut, they find out that it's a terrible position. It's very steep, at least in this section, and it's difficult to get down. A lot of loose shale. This is a fairly new cut. But the guys do slide down, taking some injuries on the way down there. They slide down, and then they make their way back up the other side of the cut. Now, the Confederates did have a good view of this cut. Not at this particular moment, but they had during previous parts of the battle. And so momentarily, they were completely surprised because they didn't think that a unit of soldiers would be able to maneuver through this cut and get out to the other side. So when the 149th does get there, they're able to just unleash a few murderous volleys upon the North Carolinians, who are less than 50 yards away at this point. The officers of the Bucktails order their men to aim for the knees, because that's how close they are. Remember, I'd said you aim low when you're within 150 yards. They're aiming at the knees. That's how close that they are. And they're unleashing these murderous volleys that throw the North Carolinians back. But once everyone else knows, and the Confederate position knows that the North Carolinians are there, artillery fire, a rifle fire come raining down on that position. And this is where the inexperience starts to take hold. An experienced unit would know that we have to break ranks here. We just have to kind of make the most of this situation and get out any way that we can. The 149th is trying to preserve their ranks at all costs. So they basically do a total about face, turn around, and every company comes down the exact way that they came. And that was a bad idea, because then they get caught up on the opposite slope while all of this fire is coming down upon them. A lot of guys do manage to make it, not everybody does, and then they have to sprint right back across the field. And they're taking horrendous fire at this point, tremendous casualties. But they do eventually manage to make it back into this position, the prior position rather, along the Chambersburg Pike. Now, there's a lot more that happened at this McPherson's Ridge position, and I could get into all that, but I'm not going to, because I want to value your time, and there are books on it that I'll cite at the end of this that I got these maps from that I'm showing you. But the Bucktail Brigade manages to hold this McPherson's Ridge position for about another hour, despite everything that has happened. The 149th Pennsylvania and 150th Pennsylvania just are absolutely torn to rags by this point. The 143rd is actually doing pretty good, because they had those skirmishers off to the left side, and for the most part, they're just spending the entire battle not being the focus of the Confederates, and firing oblique fire upon the Confederates, and not really taking nearly as many losses as the other two. But the next hour is an exchange of movement and counter movement, back and forth. The Bucktails do one thing, the Confederates do another thing. The Bucktails do one thing, and they're utilizing every maneuver at their disposal to try to hold this position. Despite all of the casualties that they're taking, the brigade does eventually manage to withdraw in good order. And they withdrew back to Seminary Ridge to kind of hold this last stand position for the Federal Army on the first day. And they were situated on the right flank of what was their portion of the line. It wasn't the right flank in the entire Union Army, but it was the right flank of what was their portion of the line. Unbeknownst to them, there was a large gap that was forming between them and the guys who were off further to their right. As a consequence of that, they take their one company that somehow has not seen any action yet, has not fired a single shot yet, Company B, and they move them off, again, in skirmish line to guard the right flank of their part of the line. At this point, they lost the colors during this retreat. Nobody thought withdrawal, I guess would probably be the better word, actually. Nobody thought to go up and tell the guys in the color guard, hey, we're pulling back. And so there's this sort of infamous fight for the colors that happens. Eventually, as I said, the Confederates figure out there's nobody out there. What are these flags doing here? We have no idea. Something's weird. We're going to go out and investigate. So a Mississippi regiment comes up, and they move on the position, and they find out that it's just the color guard guys there. And even with that, there's a ferocious fight that breaks out, and a lot of the guys in the color guard manage to get away from that initial position, even though it's only a handful of them versus tons of Confederates. They do manage to get away, but eventually they're all killed or captured. And so the rest of the regiments are without their flags. And remember, the flags aren't just a point of pride. They are how you coordinate visually the unit oftentimes. So they're trying to get their companies together in the railroad cut, the companies that are left. As I said, a lot of these companies were completely shot to pieces. They're tending to their wounded. A lot of their officers have been wounded. So even the wounded officers are just trying to get guys together. And then an entire Confederate brigade exploited the gap between the Union line. They came up and they charged in the Company B. And because of all the smoke and all the fire, and because there are no colors, and because they don't have anybody to run messages, Company B is completely shattered before the rest of the regiment even knows that anything's going on. The Confederates charge in and they descend upon the guys who are in this other section of the railroad cut for cover and protection, just trying to get organized. And the advancing Confederates kill or capture almost all of them, and then that entire portion of the Union line is driven back to Cemetery Ridge. At the end of this fight, the 149th Pennsylvania lost over 3/4 of their men, and the 150th Pennsylvania lost 2/3 of theirs. And while this was not unique for the first day, the 149th Pennsylvania ranks well amongst the top Union regiments for losses during a single day of the war. The 24th Michigan actually also came pretty close that day. They also lost almost 3/4 of their men, and they'd both be topped on day 2 by the 1st Minnesota, which lost 81% of the men who were engaged. But this was not a completely unique experience. The Federal 1st and 11th Corps who were engaged that day lost over half of their men. Over half. And remember, they were outnumbered 2-1. And so how do you get through that? Pulling back from the tactical level, how do you experience that? How do you get through that? Can you imagine? And the only way they were able to do it and hold off the Confederates is because they were utilizing every option that they had, taking all of their training and putting it into this. And I want to note that some of those guys who were lost were captured without serious wounds, and they weren't killed. And then they were recovered once the Confederates retreated. But still, a lot of those guys were killed or wounded, and they managed to hold it together through all of that, including my ancestor, who was one of the guys who was captured in the railroad cut. He was wounded 3 times, and he managed to survive. But it's incredible to think about, and how do you do that unless you're using all the options that are at your disposal? So that's the Bucktail Brigade. That's the 149th Pennsylvania. Now we go to day 2 of Gettysburg. First of all, let's talk a little bit about why the Battle of Gettysburg was fought where it was. And again, I hate to keep sounding like a broken record, but if you watch the movie, you think that it was the topography. It was the high ground, as the movie says over and over again. But in reality, the reason that the Battle of Gettysburg was fought where it was because of the roads. There was better high ground in other locations. Now, the high ground in Gettysburg did prove particularly advantageous because of the way that Meade used it, and that's important, and we'll get back to that. But it was the road network. It wasn't the high ground. The high ground is not the most important thing in a battle. But one guy who thought that the high ground was the most important thing was General Daniel Sickles, the commander of the Union 3rd Corps. Now, Sickles, on the second day, was deployed on the far left-hand portion of the Federal Army. And General Dan is a great example of a time when you know enough to know one important thing, but that becomes dangerous because you don't understand any of the fundamentals behind that. And Daniel Sickles was not a West Pointer. He was one of the last remaining high-ranking political generals by this point of the war. He looked across the field from where his guys were situated, and he said, well, wait a second, that ground across the field is higher than where I am right now. So the best thing for me to do is to move to occupy that ground, at the very least in order to deny the Confederates that advantage. Because if they occupy that, then they'll have the high ground advantage over my men, and we don't want that. So he ordered his men to move forward into what we now call the peach orchard and the wheat field. And by doing this, he negated the advantages of the position that Meade was trying to build. And now, as I'd said before, Gettysburg was fought where it was because of the road network. And the position that the Federal Army occupied on Cemetery Ridge and on Culp's Hill and on Cemetery Hill and on later Little and Big Round Top, it was a good position because it allowed you to have good interior lines. One thing that the movie actually does get completely accurate. But the roads that were behind those interior lines made it so that Meade could shift his forces to support one another very quickly if need be. He explained this theory to all of his generals. Apparently, Sickles did not get this memo. But the point of why he was where he was good communications and mutual support. Even when the Federal Army eventually was at its maximum length on the third day, while it's 3.5 miles if you actually walk from the right flank to the left flank of the Union Army, in reality, because of the way it's bent, it's only about 2 miles between any position. So you can always put guys where you need them within about an hour at most, as long as that message gets there. But by moving forward like this, Sickles, first of all, not only extended his own line. There's a lot I could say about that, but I want to keep this moving forward. But Sickles not only extended his own line to the point where they could not support each other, the units of his corps could not support each other, but also the rest of the Army of the Potomac could not support him. There's a lot of thought that's been put into this over the years, because of his maneuver, that forced Longstreet's countermarch and everything else like that. And, there's been a lot of debate about it. But the most important thing is that this broke the fundamental advantages of the Federal position, all because of one truly obstinate general. And not obstinate in the way that McClellan thought all of his generals were being at Antietam, when they were actually just doing what they were told to do within the limitations of reality, but a truly obstinate act. And it's a perfect example of this concept of communications and of mutual support, and also how there are more important things to fighting and winning a battle than just the high ground or whatever. If you want to look at a wonderful example of a time that one side undoubtedly held the superior position of the high ground, but if anything, it was disadvantageous to them, look at Chattanooga. So in late 63, General Rosecrans tried to advance on Georgia. They captured Chattanooga, and he tried to advance on Georgia. And during that, they met the Confederate forces at Chickamauga under Braxton Bragg. It was one of the few engagements of the war because Bragg had been reinforced by Longstreet's corps after Gettysburg. It's one of the few engagements of the war where the Confederates actually outnumbered the Union Army. And they counterattacked the Federals, and Chickamauga itself would have been a huge disaster had it not been for the actions of George Thomas's corps, and he was able to hold off the Confederates just long enough that the Union was able to make a somewhat orderly retreat from that battlefield. But once they got back to Chattanooga, the Confederate forces put them under siege. They held Lookout Mountain, Missionary Ridge, and Grant was sent out to relieve the situation. And while on paper, to a less experienced general or a less thoughtful general, these Confederate positions looked amazing, and they looked completely unassailable, Grant was very easily able to first kick the Confederates off of Lookout Mountain and then open up a full supply line to the Federal forces. but then they were able to dislodge the Confederates from Missionary Ridge. Now, how were they able to do that? Missionary Ridge is a commanding position on paper, but during the course of the assault, while the Federal armies were moving up, again, the Corps under the command of General George Thomas, he was outnumbered, but something that he realized pretty quickly was that the Confederate forces arrayed on the actual crest of Missionary Ridge, or pretty close to it. Now, why is that bad? Well, in military theory, there's a concept that's called the military crest of a topographical position. The military crest is a position that is either in front of or behind the actual crest of a topographical position that allows your forces to maximize their line of sight and get more direct angles of fire upon the enemy position. Oftentimes, you want your riflemen, your infantry, to be on the forward slope, and you want your artillery to be on the opposite slope, because then they can shoot over without exposing their position. The Confederates had done neither of those things. And so, again, through very skilled use of tactics and a very skilled understanding of the situation, George Thomas, with the help of some other Federal Corps, dislodged the Confederates from what in theory was a very strong position, but in reality was not. And that's because George Thomas, again, understood something that the Confederate leaders and even a lot of the Union leaders who looked at this beforehand, Rosecrans mainly, didn't understand about the position. So there's a lot more thought and theory that's going on here than just what a lot of people have been told. After the Battle of Chattanooga in the spring of 1864, Longstreet is back east, and he is with the Army of Northern Virginia again when Grant started his advance towards, not really towards Richmond so much as using Richmond as a way to make Lee stand up and fight him. Now, they didn't want to repeat the whole Fredericksburg thing. So instead, they realized that they had to move through the wilderness. If you want a primer on the defensive advantages of Northern Virginia and the obstacles to an advancing army, then go to my video on Robert E. Lee. Grant realized that they would have to move through the wilderness, and of course that was going to open his men up to a Confederate assault. Lee, realizing that the wilderness is the best position that he can take, where he can take on the Union Army before they're able to break out of there and break into a more open position, which is exactly what Grant wanted. He wanted to fight the Confederate Army over more open ground. Lee decides that he needs to attack Grant in the wilderness. He needs to hit the Army of Northern Virginia, must strike the Army of the Potomac in the wilderness and try to stop them there. And the best way for them to do that is to deny the federal forces the road networks that they would need to be able to carry their troops and supplies out of the wilderness. So they have to make this a defensive, rather an offensive, battle for the Army of Northern Virginia. So James Longstreet is tasked with his corps to try to take a key crossroads that the Union's going to need to be able to move through the wilderness. And he looks at this situation in the wilderness, and he realizes that all this stuff that we've been talking about before, about communication, coordination, all these other things, why you're fighting in these lines that are shoulder to shoulder, it's pointless here. The lines are going to get hopelessly intermingled and entangled, and orders are going to get lost regardless. So he gives 2 orders to all of his officers to give to their men. Order number 1, advance in heavy skirmish, something that they had been trained to do. Again, it's not all just shoulder to shoulder. They've been trained to do other things. And so heavy skirmish is essentially advancing. It's separating your men out, but then having them advance in waves that are mutually supportive. So you can have someone advance while someone fires and provides them cover, and then the people behind them reload, and you move forward that way. And then also, he ordered all of his men, don't worry about regiments, don't worry about companies, obey the orders of the closest officer to you. And so the Confederates moved forward this way. And they had a good bit of success, a lot more than they probably would have otherwise. But the offensive just runs out of steam before they're able to take the crossroads, because the Union only needed to fight a defensive battle here to protect the crossroads. So they're able to use more conventional tactics, and they basically don't have to move a whole lot. So they don't have this organization problem they have to worry about. So they just keep up the fire, and the advance eventually runs out of steam. But just like with the Bucktail Brigade shooting at long ranges, this is an exception that kind of proves the rule. That, this is a special circumstance, but once the normal considerations are thrown out of the window, they can fight a different way. They know what they're doing. And so we get back to September of 1864 and the trench warfare that the Union and Confederate forces are now engaged in around Richmond, around Petersburg, around Atlanta. And this gets us to the question of, why does trench warfare happen? And a lot of times we are told, whether it's the Civil War or World War I, that trench warfare is just the result of the sides coming to the realization that the new weapons are horrible and terrible, and we have to entrench, we have to dig in order to prevent casualties. But World War I started out being fought with basically the same tactics as the Civil War was fought with. Granted, they're not standing shoulder to shoulder, but it's very linear in its thinking, despite the lessons of the Civil War. And that's because in World War I, the communication still had not advanced to the point that you could have armies that are out there doing all these complex, modern-seeming, World War II style maneuvers. And so it's not really the advances in weapons technology that are affecting, this movement towards trench warfare. The fact of the matter is that trench warfare happens when you have armies that are in the same position for long enough, and also the infrastructure it either concentrates in one place or denies an enemy the ability to just go around that. You have to take this position. And so when you're frozen in place like that, whether it's World War I, Civil War, or even going all the way back to the Revolution and wars before that, you're going to dig in, you're going to fortify. And that's what happens at the end of the Civil War. The conditions that had gotten them to that point of being able to fight in open fields, of being able to maintain maneuverability as a consideration, they're dead now. And that's why the armies were bogged down in trench warfare. Actually, when the Army of Northern Virginia gets kicked out of Richmond and Petersburg finally, Lee's relieved to be able to fight in the open battlefield again, because he thinks he can take advantage of this situation to maneuver again. And of course, that's not what ends up happening. He gets the noose closed around his neck by the Northern armies and is eventually forced to surrender. But the trench warfare that developed at the end of the war, that everybody thinks should have been there to begin with, it's not because the armies finally came to their senses. It was because there was nowhere left to maneuver to. And so this is what you got to do now. This is the new reality. And so you might be thinking now, all right, you sold me. You went through all this. You convinced me of the necessity for linear tactics because of the limitations and the way that warfare was fought at that time. I no longer think that the horrendous casualties were because they were stupid. Obviously, these guys knew what they were doing. But if these are the conditions you have to accept to fight a war, then it's dumb to fight a war. To which I say, you finally get it. You finally get it. It's not the guys in the battlefield who are stupid. It's the people with political power and the leadership who are willing to fight over these pointless causes, who are willing to send men to die for slavery or racial supremacy, or so they can get a little bit more land. They are the idiots. It's not the guys who are actually fighting the battles. They understand the situation better than the people with political power understand it, and better than people today who aren't part of that can possibly understand it. But I hope you understand through this, I mean, first of all, that war is stupid and pointless, and honestly, advances in modern tactics have not prevented horrendous deaths, death tolls. We can see that now in a lot of the active conflicts when people are so committed to a cause that they will sacrifice anybody else that they can to that cause, whether it's their own civilians or the enemy's civilians, or their own soldiers, or the enemy's soldiers. That's where the breakdown happens. And I hope you understand through this that the guys who are fighting the Civil War weren't dumb. They were doing what made sense within their context. And oftentimes when the context is removed from history, it's by someone who wants to craft a narrative that fits with some point that they're trying to make about a modern issue, rather than sincerely trying to learn about what the past has to teach us. For the political class on one side, that means portraying people in the past as inherently stupid and unsophisticated so that they can make some sort of point about the unstoppable march of progress and the moral arc of history, so that you, the regular person, will accept incremental changes to some sort of monumental injustices that are going on, whether those are social injustices or things that are happening to you in the moment. And then for the political class on the other side, that means structuring conversations about the past in such a way that simultaneously tells people that those blokes in the past, they were just so much more courageous than people in our degraded age. But then so that you don't think too hard about their asking you to sacrifice to preserve some monumental injustice, because it'll turn out differently this time. We have it figured out. It'll be different. Your courage will make you feel like a man, and it won't leave you hollow, emasculated, and embittered like it left the past generations. And it's funny that even while writing and recording this, I couldn't help but to slip back into old patterns of behavior of kind of sounding like the very thing I condemn now. Of making war seem awesome and glorious, or celebrating the moves of commanders over the actual experiences of men fighting. But when I made those mistakes, I decided to leave it in to kind of help make the point that I'm not being preachy here. Self-reflection is not the same thing as being perfect. It's best practice to counter the reality that none of us is actually perfect. So if there is any point I want you to take away from these videos other than, a better understanding of what was really going on during the Civil War, it's that segment I just gave you. That's the point that I want to leave you with, and the point that I want folks to think about. So that's the video. Thank you for listening, and I hope that you will like and subscribe and leave comments if you have anything that you want to say. Critical comments, positive comments, I accept them all, so it's fine. As I've said before, there are going to be, the release schedule was not going to be as frequent as it was when I first started out the channel. With a lot of moving parts in my life right now, but I do have other videos that I plan to make, and those should be out here at some point in the future. So thank you again for listening, and have a good day, everybody.